Good morning, Roger Lewis here, aka Tone Freaks, and this is going to be a fairly long video, just following up on some research that I've been doing over the last 6 weeks about energy, energy supplies, and some of the spikes we're seeing in energy prices. And I'm fitting that into a general context of some other sort of important resource commodities and indicators, which are pointing to an accelerated general direction of decline. I mean, the title that I put on this blog was From Home Owning Democracy to Techno Fascist Banana Republic. And unless we're very careful, that's pretty much where this monopolistic, it's more than a monopolistic term, this monopolistic acceleration into, a new age of robber barons, really. So anyway, I'm just going to dive in, make a few points, and then look at a bunch of indicators which I've got open on my screen with various comparisons of different indexes on trading economics. And then I'm going to look at the latest House of Lords report in the United Kingdom about affordable housing, affordability, which completely misses the point as to what the problem is in terms of distribution of resources, both energy resources, physical housing resources, and then also the general production of domestic and world economy. So I'm going to go through making these points, and then I'll probably do a longer blog then with screen captures of the different slides that appear, and maybe do a bit more analysis from there. So the blog that I did yesterday, January the 11th, was Paradigms Lost and Found. Now, Tim Morgan on the Surplus Energy Economics blog, Seeds blog, did a post in 2017 called Paradigms Lost, which obviously is a pun on John Milton's Paradise Lost. It's a very famous epic poem. And so here's a quote from Paradise Lost. "Into this wild abyss, the womb of nature and perhaps her grave, of neither sea nor shore, nor air nor fire, but all these in their pregnant causes mixed, confusedly, and which thus must ever fight, unless the Almighty Maker them ordain his dark materials to create more worlds. Into this wild abyss, the wary fiend stood on the brink of hell and looked a while, pondering his voyage, for no narrow frith he had to cross." So anyway, this starts off with this. It's an hour-long film by this gentleman here. This is Mr. Lightfoot, who's a Canadian engineer. And he's talking about energy, how important it is to society. And he looks at the different energy mixes going forward. And he has come to the conclusion that nuclear energy is really the best available thing that we have for making up any shortfall through declining oil production, or indeed if oil production has reached its maximum, and even if it stays there, for the general lot of the human family, so populations in developing and emerging economies. So these are economies in Africa, economies in Asia, China, and Russia are kind of called transition economies, although China not so much. It's sort of a case in and of itself in many respects. My question to myself, are we heading more towards a Chinese way of doing things or more towards a Swedish way of doing things? Now, I live in Sweden, and the Swedish way of doing things is great for Sweden, works for Sweden. I suspect that culturally, my place of birth, Wales, and the United Kingdom. So for all the differences within the United Kingdom, the difference between Sweden and all of those differences put together, say between Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England, or even the north of England, the south of England, if you sum all of those differences together, they do not add up to the difference between Sweden, which is remarkably even across how it is culturally, the length and breadth of the country, or certainly in the bottom third anyway. So where most of the sort of Western type, i.e. not the indigenous Sami folk who live in the top 2/3 of Sweden, but there are way more in that bottom third, and the main conurbations, Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmo. But anyway, so in terms of the Scandic model, the Scandinavian model, when people refer to that, they're tending really to refer to Sweden and a little bit Finland. Norway is kind of out on its own, very rich, obviously, with the oil, gas, natural resources. And then Denmark again. The difference between Denmark and Sweden, I would say, is as marked as the difference between Britain and Sweden, and that Denmark probably lies somewhere in between. And so effectively a one-size-fits-all economic and political economy governance structure. Anyone that thinks that's going to work and that people would be happy with a one-size-fits-all, I think need to get out more, travel a bit more, and I don't see how it can work. That's not to say that there shouldn't be common, say, a common financial instrument to promote international trade. I mean, obviously that's necessary, but that's a completely different question to then what happens within those boundaries. So things like the trade and services agreement within the large trade deals, which is basically a corporate charter to place corporations above local law, etc. It's just a bad idea. It's anti-democratic, and all of that has been tried and tested in the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was debated at length in the 1992 election, which was the one between George Bush the First, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot. And Ross Perot's presentations and predictions for NAFTA have basically all come substantially true. And so we're going to look at some indicators in a minute coming up, which I'll point out key dates, which I guess coalesce around the very late 90s and the early 2000s. And so the introduction of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, so GATT and the World Trade Organization, and the famous Seattle round of that, where there's a very good Woody Harrelson film about Seattle and stuff, and I'll show you some other Seattle stuff when I'll click down my BitChute channel shortly. So anyway, energy it's tremendously important. And I've spent the last 6 weeks turning out blogs, reading various books on these subjects, covering a broad swathe of time. So the modern era for energy politics kind of begins with what's known as the oil shock in '73 and the OPEC increases in crude oil prices, etc. The OPEC cartel actually got going a lot before then. And so that story, whilst that's seen as a pivotal point, it's actually more nuanced than that. And I put up a film by a guy called Daniel Estelin. Was it Daniel Estelin? Yeah, about the Bilderberg Group. And the Bilderberg Group met in Sweden in 1972, and the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, attended that meeting. He was actually assassinated about 20 years later in the early 19... No, he wasn't. It was about 15 years later in I think it was around 1987. But there's these... That meeting discussed oil and oil supply and the dependence on oil supply coming from the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia at that time. And there's been an ongoing discussion then in the international central bank community, the Bank of International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, all watch the, crude oil production and energy prices generally very, very carefully, and for good reason. Now, this blog goes on to discuss a topic of conversation which had cropped up on the Tim Morgan blog, and so that's what this blog starts off with, that, and then goes into some of the alternative sources of energy and solutions to these problems. Now, the problem of energy has kind of been dominated in discussions with respect to carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of hydrocarbons or so-called fossil fuels. And that discussion is about saying we can't use hydrocarbons because they're causing man-made global warming, right? Now, there's another discussion which you can put that to one side, whether you are convinced by that hypothesis of anthropogenic global warming or not, the CO2 hypothesis. You can put it to one side, and there is another question surrounding hydrocarbons or fossil fuels, and whether or not enough of them are able to be produced in any event to support economic activity expanding in the developing world and the emerging economy world. I don't think China can kind of really be put into the emerging economy world right now, and I don't think Russia correctly belongs in that. But the idea is that the world population is about 7.8 billion at the moment. Between China and India, there are about 3 billion people, give or take. Russia has a very small population in relation to its land mass. I think it's a couple to 300 million or so. The population of the European Economic Area the EU area, if you like, and Britain, I think, is about 500 million people. The United States, I think, has about 330 to 360 million people. Africa has how many people Africa has. But anyway, they all add up to about 7.8 million people. But China, with its billion or so people, per head of population, use less energy than countries like Sweden or countries in the Euro area. Canada uses quite a lot. America uses a great deal. But it's used for different things, for different purposes. But the general idea is that on the average, if the average amount of energy being used in the developed world was also used in the developing world, would there be enough energy? How much energy is there? And so then you have to look at the energy mix. So the discussion about burning hydrocarbons and that causing CO2, you can put that to one side. And the question is, has production of hydrocarbons peaked, or even will it plateau? If it can't meet all of the energy demands to bring up the general well-being level of meeting needs and wants, etc., how do you fill in the gap? Can you fill in the gap? Now, the next question is if it actually declines and you don't fill in the gap, what happens then? And so you get into discussions about, if there isn't enough energy, how much energy is there, and what level of economic activity or what level of available goods are there able to be produced, and would that actually necessarily shrink? Now, of course, this is then when you get into discussions about renewals or alternative. So you get into technological discussions about what are the potentials for filling in the gap, and if you start off in a pessimistic mood and assume the worst case in all aspects of in all scenarios, you can get to a very catastrophic pace. If you assume the best in every case, then obviously you can convince yourself, it was not even worth thinking about. And as usual, with those two polarities, somewhere in between the two is probably where you come out. And it's that view generally tends to be close, in my view, my experience of being on this earth. People who take a more of a balanced view, tend to have it more right than wrong. Now, the fashion for being some sort of soothsayer. So I'm thinking about Nicholas Taleb and his long tales and his fooled by randomness and all of this sort of thing. That way of looking at things, in my view, is a very speculative view of the world, based upon betting on these outcomes and winning for your small team or for yourself, kind of thing. Now, more broadly speaking, the way that I would approach the problem as a valuer would be to look at what are the various scenarios, including the current rules of the game, but you can also broaden out, and you can do a stock take and you can look at the inputs flowing into stock and potential outputs, and then you can get a feeling on. I'm not sure what that means. Anyway, so it's those sorts of things which I'm kind of looking to try and figure out. I'm just going to go on my channel here and see if this is actually. There might be some feedback in a minute, I'm afraid. Let's see. That's the introduction. There's a bit of a break now, so here we go. Okay, well, there is some sound coming out there, so that's okay. Right, so I'll put links in the description to this blog here, and the discussion that I have started to have on the Seeds blog, where I haven't commented for the last couple of years, is on a blog called Unraveling Catastrophe, and that I put Seeds of Hope or Seeds of Destruction. And then the other blog, which I've referred to, is this one here. No, this one here, which is Paradigms Lost. And so, of course, that's Tim's blog. You can read that. And then in the comments, there's a really interesting discussion about whether or not the energy question is deliberately obscured by the CO2 question, and what the implications for that may be. Rationing CO2 by carbon footprint is a different thing to sell to a population to rationing pure energy resources, admitting that a hard limit has been met as regards the amount available energy and what then that allows to happen. Of course, questions then arise as to whether or not you would voluntarily go for, say, net zero by 2030. How wise is that if, in fact, by 2050, hydrocarbons are likely to be at below what they need to be, and alternative energy sources need to be developed in between. But alternative energies over and above that can be produced by solar and wind power, and it's a very complex equation because there are a lot of variables, all with different inputs, and the best treatment of that question of the variables that I've seen is Professor McKay's renewable energy. Renewable energy without hot air, and again that's linked to. So this Thomas Malthus, that's obviously a bit of a pun because Malthus was a famous population bomb pessimist, catastrophist, or whatever. But I just want to get to, actually, I'll find it easier here. So as we come down here, I'm going to get to these plots in a minute and start putting some data to some of these more general sweeping statements that I've been making here. And some various sort of geopolitical events tend to make more sense if you think in terms of access to the energy. So here we are. So this commenter here, Don Stewart, had said this, right? Gail Tverberg, who has commented on a blog called The Oil Drum in the past, but also has a blog called Our Finite Planet, told me a number of years ago that some of the insiders at the Oil Drum thought that climate change was put into the spotlight to divert attention from the real problem, which was energy. Also, for anyone who cares, there's a link to Johnson's talk in Sonoma County earlier this year. This is about putting carbon back into the soil. You know, so the hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, all of those things regarding the balance of equal and opposites, the yin and yang, if you like. So, of course, the discussion about what's known as Jevons paradox. This is where you make savings, they get spent elsewhere. And so you might find that although you become more efficient, you need more stuff. And that way of thinking and applying that as a general rule then to general reasoning can lead you to a set of scenarios that look very bad, whereas very small changes in a few of those variables or a different assumption or a different outcome can change things quite radically. And so then that gets to the heart of the idea of modeling. And this is a problem we've had with the COVID-19 modeling. You know, the Ferguson models are out by huge amounts. I think initially something like 500,000 people were predicted to have died. The current figure for over 2 years is said to be 150,000, but we're just seeing Dr. Fauci and other people at the American CDC at the moment saying, well, actually, there's been some double counting or over counting of how significant a COVID-19 diagnosis has been in relation to other morbidities, i.e. Other things actually killed someone. The example that Dr. Fauci gave the other day was that someone with a broken leg that then also has and is in hospital, if they've also got COVID, you don't count it as a COVID. It was the broken leg that killed them or something. So this is the problem. Lies, damn lies, and statistics is what it boils down to. But anyway, that comment there was from this discussion in December 17th, 2017. Now, as you'll see when we come up to some of this data in a minute, already by that time, there were various warning signals in different indicators, which, on my argument, led to problems in the financial system that showed up in what's known as the repo rate, which is the overnight lending rate between banks in New York in September 2019, and a whole bunch of bailing out then ensued. And I'm going to show you the broader graphs, but that Fed rate spike is, I think, at the start of the blog I did before this one. Right, let's just have a look here. Updated. So this one here, Peak Prometheus, nothing to see here, don't look up. So I don't look up the Netflix movie. It's supposed to be about climate change. I mean, it works just about what it's about, really. And it's not actually a very good example of something that's happening compared to a slow burn idea of even on the hypothesis of CO2 being a damaging and dangerous thing. The chicken lickings, all the boy crying wolf thing has been going on, well, for as long as I can remember. Let's just see this spike now. There we go, this is the one. So there it is there, look, 17th September 2019, the overnight repo rate spiked from 2.5% up to 8.5%. And there was a similar spike in this market at the time of the global financial crisis when the Lehman Brothers moment happened. And we'll see a lot of things that were feeding into indicators of problems when we look up here. You can see there all of these. I'm going to go through these shortly. So that's that one. And then the other thing, so this is Paradigms Lost and Found. Right, now, before all of the pandemic stuff came on the scene, so this I posted November the 13th, 2009, and President Trump gave a speech at the New York Economic Club. And you can see I've got a word cloud, and you can see he mentions energy 14 times. And obviously about American oil, about becoming a net exporter of gas and stuff like that. And how important that had been to what had been a remarkable economic renaissance in flyover Rust Belt America. This is a brilliant analysis of this question. It repays a visit. You can open the transcript, and if you put in with the open transcript search energy, you can go to the bits where he addresses these questions. But I think that this is and will be, people look back on this as being a particularly prescient speech in 2019. Now, the problems that were in store we'll see in other data, okay, the problems in the world economy which have manifested through the period of the pandemic, but were already portended by that spike in the repo rate that I've just shown you, have been stored up since 2008. And again, what's actually happened is that a lot of debt was created to repair the balance sheet of banks who had basically bankrupted themselves through their own hubris and poor credit allocation decisions. And that money then went back into blowing up an asset bubble of existing stuff without production. Now, that typifies what's happened in the developed economies to greater or lesser extent, and we'll look at that in a minute. In China, they've got a different set of problems because they've got a productive economy growing, whilst they also have a speculative part of the economy. Now, picking the bones out of all of this and finding good analysis about this different way of spending fiat-created currency is Richard Werner's theory of disaggregated credit, which effectively, what's being disaggregated is the credit created for speculation and the credit created for wealth creation, commerce, adding value, etc. Now, that distinction in Richard's hands, and with the data that he points to, and other people that have built on that work, is a very compelling argument that the economic system, as it presently stands, is obsessed with speculation and asset price bubbles, and that people that are benefiting from an increased amount of claims in their hands on the real economy is meaning that the real economy is suffering with such a large, with an over fat financialized sector. That's effectively what we're talking about, and you can see it in the data that we're going to go through in a minute. Now, as far as the energy question goes on this thing, that it's very good. Of course, Donald Trump is a property developer, and he's a property developer that builds stuff. So he's not so much, in a way, he's a merchant property developer. Whilst no doubt he does speculate and has made gains through speculation or general inflation of asset bubbles. Not all real estate people actually do build things to sell or build, and I call those people merchant developers, including myself. Speculative developers, it's a different question. And so speculating on existing assets and just going through cycling through that is not adding any value. Of course, if you're speculating on the system and exploiting various opportunities, you are making money and increasing your own claims, but you're not adding anything to the general size of the pie. It's the existing pie just gets a bigger price tag. That there isn't actually any extra pie, if I can put it that way. So anyway, these are the general sort of set of questions which I'm just going to go through now. That's the discussion from 2017. I just showed you the Gail Troveberg comment about, is it really about energy or is it about CO2? Which is a very good, very deep question. Now, this guy is a guy called Tim Garrett. He's an expert on snowflakes, apparently, and he's done some work with Steve Keen, who's a heterodox economist, who, in my opinion, has thrown his lot in with the Doomer Brigade, which includes Tim Garrett here. And there's a discussion on The Unraveling Begins about a paper which Steve Keen, Garrett, and a third guy have written. Now, the comment that I made on that is in the Paradigms Lost and Found blog, which I showed earlier, but my comment didn't get published. I've made two small apologies, but for whatever reason, I don't know why it hasn't appeared. you can read it yourself and see. I think it would have added something to the discussion, but clearly Tim doesn't want to think more broadly, challenging his feeling that he thinks he's got his measure of prosperity related to available energy about right. I'm not convinced of that, because I haven't seen anything with hard data from Tim that makes him any more right than the Garrett paper about average world capital stock based on cumulative gross world product, really gross domestic or gross world product is what they're talking about in that paper. This paper here, identification of a 50-year scaling relating to current global energy demands to historically cumulative economic production. I don't think this is a very good paper. It quotes from another paper, which is a much better paper, by a guy called Sorrell. Here we are. This paragraph 45, and there are links to this paper and the other one in the blog, which I did. So let's just I wrote a review of a book called The Economic Superorganism by a I'll just show you that here now. Just back here. This one here, look, The Economic Superorganism, Carey W. King. So I wrote a review about that book because that addresses a bunch of these questions as well. I found that book from another paper which Carey King had written about 10 years ago, which actually I felt was onto something a lot more important to all these questions than this book. This book, I think, has gone off at a tangent, which is the point I make in the review. So that's just digressing at the moment. So let's start then with some figures. Right, one of my favourite indicators is the Baltic Dry Index, and here you see it from 1985 up to 2020, and the Baltic Dry Index is an index of costs of hiring container ships, and it famously was very, very low after the cataclysmic global financial crisis. So 1st of October 2008, it went as low as 686, but then in 2016, it even went lower than that. It went down to 131, and then in March 2020, it didn't get as low as the 2016 figure, but it was down at 400. At the moment, it's at 2151, so it's dropped a lot recently. But if we look at the forecast here, you can see the forecast seems to be for it to be around this level with it trending down. And in terms of statistics here, the mean is about 3,000. It's pushing down to 2,000 and has a variance up to about 4,000. So it's about a third underneath where it could be. Excuse me. Hello, Roger Lewis.
Hello.
Hi, Nova.
Can you please put your piano?
You want to be picked
And
up?
keep me off this.
Hold on a second. Anyway, suffice to say, on the Baltic Dry Index, it is down quite low. Let's go for the summary again. The key measures. At the moment, it's nothing like November 2008 or January 2016. But basically, the journey from January 2016 kind of led into there are lots of variables pulling in different directions. So obviously with the lockdowns, so you see here, 3rd of February 2020, it was low for those reasons. So it's kind of like an induced coma in the economy, really. And then that there is the where the supply chain problems started. Container ships ended up in the wrong place. Hire car companies have ended up without fleets, and of course they can't buy new cars because there's a chip shortage, and so all of these things tend to compound on each other. So from an index like this, you can see, well, that shows that goods aren't being moved from A to B, and so there could be a problem when they make up the shortfall. And obviously rates would go up in that thing, but they're falling again at the moment. So in and of itself, it's just one indicator which will lead to interrogating other potential outcomes from that. What's the cause of this? What may that then lead on to? So that's the Baltic Dry Index, which is falling presently. And as I say, if you look at the stats there, it could go either way at that point. Whether it goes back up again or down again. It's trending down at the moment. The forecast here, you can see there's a broad sweep here, but it's I'm looking at that, and it could go either way. That would be my takeaway from there. I happen to believe that where I think it will likely deteriorate. That's my current sort of gut feeling, if you like, but I'm still thinking that one through. So that's the Baltic Exchange Dry Index. So on trading economics, you can you get all sorts of indicators: G10, 20 countries, then the American continent, Europe, etc. Now, I've been through this earlier and just picked up some interesting ones, just to look at some trends. So, right, these first things are to do with home ownership and house indexes, and something I've noticed over the last couple of years is that the level of home ownership has fallen across the G20. So here in the United Kingdom, from 73% in 2008 to 65% This is in 2018. It's around that figure still. It's sort of bumping around. The trend though is oh no, that's average house prices. That's the trend for average house prices. But prices are going up, home ownership is going down. Look at the euro area. So the house index, you can see it sort of bumped along after the recession, but started recovering around 2016. But home ownership rate declined a lot after 2010 from 72% to 67%, and it's trended down to about 66% since then, as prices have been going up. So that's a concentration of wealth going on right there. United States home ownership rate. So this is the US from 69 up to 1980, it went up. Then after the 80s recession, it fell down again, bumped along the bottom. Then in the 90s, it climbed to its height of about 69%. And then after 2008, it just plummeted to about 63% here. But meanwhile, the Saving the Poor Case-Shiller House Index has just been climbing. It's doubled from 2012 to about, well, it's gone up to about nearly 300. It's 270 or so. So again, you see the same trend. Overall levels of home ownership are falling. Right, now Mexico just has a construction output. It doesn't have a level of home ownership published. Right, so we're going to go into some other US indicators here now. No, Sweden. So even in Sweden, you can see the house price index has been, it had a dip in 2017-18, but the general trend has been up. So the index has gone from 2006, where it was 100, up to about 300. So in 16 years, it's actually trebled. But the level of home ownership has dropped from 69%. It's recovered to 65% recently, but it got to a low 63.8% or whatever. But again, it's the same trend. South Africa building plans. Well, so again, South Africa only has a building permits measure for housing. It doesn't have the home ownership measure. China, this is interesting. It's commercial residential, and you can see, I mean, that's a very, very strange curve there, as is the China newly built home price index. It's up and down, up and down. I mean, that looks like a command and control managed economy. That doesn't look like any natural kind of free market activity. Arguably, the consistency of all the other trends is explicable by the disaggregated theory of credit, but it's not nearly as micromanaged or technocratically managed up till now as what you see there in China. So here we go. Australia home ownership, again, same story. Back in 1969, over 70%, over 71% home ownership, and that fell back down in 1980 to about 69%, recovered to around 70%, fell back to 91, then recovered back up to late 60s levels of about 71%, or just shy of 71%. But since then, it's kind of had a step in coming down, but now it's down to 66%. And you can see the residential property index has, since the early 2000s, it 100 on this index is around 2013, and it's since then it's got up to about 180. So that's almost a doubling of prices. But what's happened is less and less people are actually in home ownership. So that's the same trend that we see elsewhere. New Zealand, the same thing. Home ownership rate down from nearly 74% to 64 and a bit, nearly 65%. It's in 2018. And again, you see the house price index, this average prices actually, average house prices have gone from under 200,000 in 92 to pushing 1 million, which is incredible. In 2020. So that's a pretty dramatic trend there. So anyway, and then we come to commodities. So energy commodities, metals, agriculture, and industrial commodities and so forth. Livestock, poultry in Sweden. Sweden has the most expensive poultry prices anywhere else in the world. I can only assume it's because they're reared and have to have a lot of energy to keep them warm in the winter. That's what I'm assuming. I think they also have higher sort of care standards or whatever. But and then there are various sort of indexes, and I've looked at a bunch of these, and I'm just going to go through them now. So crude oil. So this is the West Texas Intermediate from, this is the whole of the thing on trade and economics, from 1986 up to 2022. So West Texas Intermediate's trading about $81.28 a barrel at the moment. It's been as high as 139.8 on June the 2nd, 2008. So this is in the run-up to the financial crisis, when then it all went pear-shaped. It dropped down to 41.24, climbed all the way back up to 113 plus. Then in April 2014, it got to about 103, and then fell back again, then down to about $33. This is back in March the 1st, 2016. Recall that's similar to the date that the Baltic Dry Index fell right back as well. Then things started recovering again, and there are various sort of factors which affect that, but most of them are political. I watched a talk by Robert Ayres where he's talking about energy and whatever, and that's one of the things he says. Vaclav Smel says the same thing. Oil prices are not, they're just not forecastable. It's a political, it's a political price, which is almost agreed at committee, or literally agreed at committee, really. And there's no trend or rhyme or reason, but big movements tend to coincide with large movements in the overall happening, the demand for oil, and it's, I guess, I think it's events, dear boy, events that affect the energy market more than any sort of cold economic theorizing about supply curves, supply and demand, and equilibrium, and all that sort of thing. There is no pattern. But these spikes do coincide with events, and so of course this one here is where it famously forward contracts on oil were actually at negative prices, but the price of a barrel of oil in May the 1st, 2020 had dropped to $19.48. I used to work for Shell UK back here in the mid 80s, so you can see $29.40 fell back to $9 in May the 1st, 86. So that obviously a big move in the mid 80s there. So right, next, Brent. So this is the Brent is a delivery of oil from a different market. West Texas Intermediate is delivery of oil at wherever that is, at Cushing, I think. So they're slightly different qualities of oil, but Brent tends to be slightly higher. Let's see, what's that saying with the forecast here? You can't really forecast it, as I say, but that's anywhere between 65 and 80. If it's bouncing between those two, I guess you'd say things are fairly rosy in the garden. I think what they call the fiscal break-even price for Saudi Arabian oil is something like $80 a barrel, 76 I think it is at the moment, whereas their production costs about $10 a barrel, and other producers have different costs. I think the lowest costs are, I think it's Kuwait, maybe it's the UAE, I'm not quite sure, but they're certainly one of those Middle Eastern places that has the lowest fiscal break-even cost. Again, these are fiscal break-even is a political thing. It's not anything to do with the cost of production per se. Right, natural gas prices. So again, you can see there was big spikes in late 2000, September 2005, June 2008, and the current spike, obviously, whilst it's a big rise from the low prices here in 2016 and 2020. You see, I mean, basically 2016 is the recession that no one ever really admits to, through to 2017. And because of the asset price inflation we've seen since that time, it's sort of people just look away. They don't think it's happened. But in the real economy, it certainly has happened. The question is why? What is it? Because resources are just gravitating towards the top, and that's the thing, or is it because there are some sort of energy constraints, and the resources going to the top? Is there a larger plan in there apart from just control and monopoly? Is there a different plan in terms of, you've got to control everything to ration everything ultimately, if the energy problems the world face are likely to be severe going forward? And then the question becomes, if they are going to be severe going forward, why isn't more being done with obvious alternatives like nuclear, is it possible that the policymakers have decided for other reasons, largely connected to a wish to have a lower world population, are they happily driving the train into the buffers, as it were, and resigning themselves to the inevitable human cost of that, which sounds like a very dystopic conclusion, but it is a possibility, because there are some very extreme views held within a certain group of people, catastrophists, Malthusian, neo-Malthusianism, etc., who hold those views. And amongst them are people like Boris Johnson and Boris Johnson's father, Dominic Cummings' father-in-law, and establishment figures that have held these types of views, since the 19th century, since Malthus was writing in the whenever it was, 1800, or was it the late 1700s? I'm not quite sure. But anyway, there's the natural gas, fuel at the pump, price you pay at the pump to get around. So again, you see, dropped precipitously the global financial crisis, again fetching up here at the dip in 2016 in a period of them falling. Well, you had another period of that happening from March 1st, April 2019 down to December 2019. That's where the repo spike was, around here. So there'd been a biggish fall, and then the precipitous fall, obviously March, so between February and March, but that fall was already taken place ahead of COVID, which is quite interesting. And then obviously it gets a big blow, and then sort of gets back up again. So let's just look at the stats here. This is gasoline prices. I think it's all-time high, 363, July 2008. It's interesting. Right, there we go. Coal. So again, it's spiking up here. Coal is hugely needed by places like China and everywhere else for providing electricity and the base load on national grids. So there you go. So we've had a peak in 2018, September 1st, 2016, down again there. So this is the recession that nobody, the recession that wasn't a recession, the one that everyone's in denial about almost. And then you've got a low point here at the end of 2008, February 2009, and then up to 2011, then down again. And there's lots of policies around the use of coal which aren't to do with the energy needs of the world, but have got to do with the narrative surrounding the carbon dioxide emissions policies. So naphtha. Now naphtha is a distillate of crude oil, and it's very important for making things like fertilizers and stuff like that. So naphtha, ammonia. So it's a kind of petrochemical type of idea. And so again, you can see its price is kind of a function of the crude oil price, and it goes up and down with economic activity. I think analysing that is probably more complicated because obviously agricultural production, you've got to produce a level of food to keep everybody alive. And, you know, if you think in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever, you know, shelter, food, and those sorts of things. So you can see as they go up and down, the other thing to say about this is that a price of $1,056 in 2008 compared to a price of 755. So in real terms, there's a lot more money in the world in 2022 than there was in 2008. I'm going to get to those figures in a minute. So in terms of if you had $1 in 2008, say, before the crisis, by the time you get to 2022, to have, for it to be worth as in proportion to all the other dollars, you probably need $3 to make up the difference just for the amount of extra money there is. So effectively, if you've held that dollar, you've been diluted. You know, the exact sort of to's and fro's of that is something that could be worked out accurately. But as a rule of thumb, we're going to get some curves in a minute which sort of demonstrate what I'm getting at there. Right, copper. Again, it's up. It's at an all-time high here in current day monies. In terms of equivalent monies, that's harder to say. Vaclav Smil does a very good analysis of actual electricity prices in relation to the number of hours you have to work to get a unit of electricity, and it's fallen a lot since electricity first came on the scene and was available to buy, as it were. So that's worth thinking about there. So that's the price of copper. Steel. At the end of the financial crisis there, it was fairly low, went up again, fell all the way down here, and then went back up again. So 2016 it reached a low point, it was pushed back up again. Then in 2018 it was falling back, and in October 2019 is one of the whole low prices, and then of course all of the COVID thing came. So the COVID pandemic response has coincided with a very bad patch in the world economy. They're coincident, and the response to COVID, in many respects, is addressing a different problem that happened here. And effectively, what has happened is the COVID response has bailed out the banks, who have basically, since 2008, continued to compound all the same things that caused the problems in 2008. Now, there's another question about that as well, is was the ability of the economy to expand at that point hitting a hard limit in terms of available energy? and how quickly other energy could come on stream. And that's the big question here. And is that the big question of our time? In my view, I think it is, and it's a much bigger question than the CO2 narratives. But the CO2 narratives and the responses to the CO2 narratives, similar to the COVID-19 narratives, the response to COVID-19, the responses, whilst they make no sense with respect to what they say they're about, they make a lot of sense in terms of how the financial system is able to respond to energy production realities and availability of energy realities. And it's those things, I think, that we need to look at and scrutinize very carefully. And in terms of asserting our democratic rights as citizens to say, hey, we should also have a say, we should get a chance to vote about these priorities. And by obscuring this question, what there's a small group of people trying to effectively set the hair running in a direction that they will benefit from themselves, or according to a set of policies that the rest of us aren't supposed to be intelligent enough to understand. So that the self-styled elites have this elitist that they know best and the rest of us at best, maybe worthy of sitting in audience given a round of applause, but you're certainly not supposed to ask any critical thinking questions. So anyway, so there's steel. What else? Iron ore. Again, it's the similar ups and downs with the proviso when we get to some of the money supply figures in a minute. Lithium, very important to production of magnets and stuff like that. So it's an important thing in terms of energy storage now for intermittent supplies of energy like solar or wind. And in terms of balancing out availability of energy on demand, as opposed to when Mother Nature decides to blow wind or to let the sun come out. So there's lithium, lots of lithium in Afghanistan, by the way. So there you go. Let's have a look. What else have we got there? Wheat, so staple food stuff for a lot of us. Again, various food riots in Mexico in the early 2000s was driven by the price of wheat flour. So again, a peak there in 2008, another peak in 2012, 2016 it's fallen right back, but it's actually fairly high at the moment. If we look at the stats here, again with the proviso that 2022 prices need to be adjusted by a factor or divided by, I don't know, 2.5 or 3 to get to some sort of equivalence. Again, you can see in terms of how much money of our disposable incomes we spend on food, we're spending less than we did in the past. Now, again, I'm not doing this as a depressing thing, because I actually think that the current production possibilities, technology, and all the rest of it, there are huge gains we can make in lots of areas if we get monopolists to stand out of the way. Monopolists are trying to get things to stay the same to improve their overall strategic position and share of a stable or even shrinking pie. They're happy as long as, in terms of relative to what they see as their peers, that they're doing okay. Whereas the actual fact is that if if lobby groups, particularly powerful, don't affect what's happening going forward to shore up their own positions, as it were, there's a lot more that can actually be done with what there is. So Bucky Fulmer's writer called it doing more with less, and you can do that. Now, people will argue Jevons paradox against that, which is that the less you use, the more of it you use for other stuff in terms of energy. And those sorts of balancing equations are things that Bjorn Lundberg are really, really good at. So Bjorn Lundberg, who's quite happy to entertain the CO2 hypothesis, then also says, but actually, how do we deal with we need to adapt according to what are the best ways to direct our resources to cause the least amount of harm from a harm which is identified. And looking at that another way, it's just a way of spending the energy budget and adapting the energy budget going forward. And in terms of looking at priorities and deciding what priorities ought to be. So wheat farming, there are lots of questions like petrochemical fertilizers and whatnot, and permaculture over monoculture, and there are lots of very strong ecological arguments against modern farming methods, but obviously in terms of transitioning to one way or another, doing it to feel good or to satisfy some ideological thing, if it means that other people are going to starve, I don't think that's okay. And yet the breadth of thinking that tends to go on in catastrophist kind of what's the word now? People who are anti-human tend to not see the possibilities or potentials. It all has to be bad news. But it isn't all bad news. Is just the point I wanted to make. So then we come to lumber, subject near to my heart as a merchant property developer. But of course, lumber has spiked after falling in that original thing. It's got the usual sort of ups and downs, which you can plot against well-known events like the global financial crisis, or like the oil shock, or the first Iraq War, second Iraq War, all of that sort of thing. Right, milk. Again, that's very important in terms of good start in life. And Maggie Thatcher, milk snatcher. People of my generation remember that stuff. Vaclav Smil sort of mentions about drinking milk and general health and people being tall and whatever in his book about energy transitions. So again, the usual ups and downs, and we're at an up spike at the moment. Look at the stats here. Where are we? We're way above the variance from the mean there. And in terms of the forecast, it's going up. Is that because cows fart and they're making it hard for dairy to produce economically? Where are we? Rice, obviously a staple in Asia. Again, this is the other question about the way that supermarkets merchandise and make available out of season fruits all year round and all the rest of it. Again, that is a saving that can be made everywhere in terms of the energy that you know to do that. And the amount of wasted energy in the existing system, if we have to adapt to a period where we're ramping up our production of energy to allow for expansion of developing economies and all the rest of it, and to maintain our own sort of status quo, if you like. And in terms of the status quo in the developed world, squeezing the middle and the poor whilst privileging the very top, and the concentration of wealth we've seen, the concentration of wealth we have at the moment is not a good idea. I mean, I'm not anti-capitalism. I don't, there's no green eye in me saying this. It's just that with the concentration of wealth that we have, they're patently failing to, as monopolists invariably always fail, in terms of growing a market or improving a product. That's not what monopolies do, and we're living in a monopolistic robber baron age. Not a good idea, and it was tackled in the early 1950s with various antitrust acts, and in the late 1800s, things like the Sherman Trust Acts in the US. Now, how effective a lot of that legislation was deregulated out of the system through the 1980s and 90s, and is further deregulated out by these international trade deals, which are effectively just monopolist charters. So anyway, there's rice. Let's just see where we are with that, because this sort of thing could affect China quite a lot. And we're way out of the variance there, and the forecast is up again. That's not good news. Let's see. Right, oats. Again, we're at a peak there. Forecast. Oh, well, that's a bit better news on the forecast, but you can see we're coming down within the variance here. Now, I know here in Sweden, where oats are a crop, it makes sense to, get your oats. It's my motto. Right, aluminium. Okay, very important industrial product. Again, peak here again. Forecast. That could go either way from the stats. Well, it's going away from the thing there, so that's headed in a bad direction. Germanium's very important. Things like transistors and stuff. So it's very important in electronics. Let's have a look at the forecast here. That could go either way. Good God. Now that is a really strange curve. That looks manipulated to me. There's someone up to no good in the germanium market. That's clearly wash trading through there. Blimey, got to watch these buggers. Where are we now? Right, EU carbon permits. So here we are. Now this is quite a big story, really. So that's the focus there in terms of the stats. It's heading away from the various at an alarming rate. Now, when we start getting to some of the central banking type things, I think carbon permits, vaccine passports, which are really bank books for digital currencies, and also currency rationing energy through carbon footprints. It's a way of turning hydrocarbons into a kind of a hard rationed gold standard, which there's a big cynical element to the general trend, I think, of monetary and energy policy, which is forcing the population curve into a decline, population control in short, ahead of anywhere close to where it needs to be in terms of, where things may level off or head just in the natural course of things. And so I think people like Bill Gates, who have a deep belief in these sort of population control ideas, these Malthusian ideas, Boris Johnson, though that group of people, the Rockefellers, and I don't think that they're capable of addressing the subject objectively, in my own view. And I think that these energy policies, energy production policies, and the resetting of the financial system that's undoubtedly needed, I don't think that Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum is the best group of people to influence that decision. Obviously, they have their view, but they should be discussing it along with other groups that have a different view. And effectively, what they're doing is kind of rushing the defence in a way. They're claiming that they're doing consultation and that they've had all this, but it's a manipulated and a false claim to any sort of democratic process or these people's ideas have not been tested rigorously in the court of public opinion, is what I'm saying, and they need to be, and they are actually quite as wrong can be about certain aspects of their policies that I know from my own research. And obviously, there are lots and lots of subjects which, for all I know, they may be absolutely right about, but I don't know about some of the things that they claim. But I do know about the narrow field in which I'm interested in, or the fields I'm interested in. I do know that they're absolutely wrong in my area of expertise. So that's those downward curves in terms of levels of home ownership and blowing up asset bubbles. They're as wrong can be about those types of issues, and their motivations and their policy goals are for a very narrow interest group, in my opinion. So this discussion about energy, it's got to be had. Where are we at in terms of available hydrocarbons? Where are we at in terms of ramping up abundant energy sources to bring up standards of prosperity across the world? Now, Tim Morgan, he's set his stall now in terms of prosperity is declining. There's nothing we can do about it because basically there isn't enough surplus energy. I think he's wrong about that. I think it ignores the potential that there is, particularly with different nuclear stuff, but other very promising energy technologies. I think where Tim's analysis falls down is he places too much emphasis on metrics from a financial system that has been broken and hasn't worked efficiently for a long time. So he might be right that part of that is to do with surplus energy, but so much of the additional created debt hasn't done anything useful. And whilst Tim claims to strip out a clean GDP figure for prosperity, stripping out a lot of that excess waste, I am not convinced that he has done that. And the analysis that I've seen, and I have asked for more depth, but but Tim feels there's a proprietary aspect to his work which may be commercialized at some point in the future. Yep, I understand that, but the simple fact is that I know lots of technologies are suppressed, that monopolists do suppress, and we've been living through an age of increasing monopoly, which engenders the loss of a great deal of potential, or the failure to exploit a lot of potential, and it's not lost. That isn't lost knowledge, and the ramping up to an innovative and striving sort of commercialism, capitalism away from. I heard David Icke actually referring to capitalism as cartelism the other day, and cartelism is actually a really good, for the financialized misallocation of credit system that we have presently. And don't forget, the people that have actually created that and made it worse are the same people that are now saying, well, follow us, we want central bank digital currencies and we know how to do this best. Really? Anyway, EU carbon permits. The forecast, yeah, that's going up. So what next? So this is the solar energy index. Again, here we go. I mean, these are rigged markets, guys. So, they're rigged markets, they're political and all the rest of it. And the curves that we see here are all about insiders feathering their own nest. But the solar energy, that's interesting because it's below the mean here. Yeah. Forecast. Well, anyway, those in the know will see that there's an arbitrage in that. If anybody wants to speculate, there's easy money in the solar energy index at the moment. Wind energy index, let's have a look. Forecast. Stats, same thing there. Very interesting. Nuclear energy index. Let's have a look. What's this one doing? See, that makes no sense at all. You see, those other two are obviously, there's a lot of insider bullshit going on there. But in a rational market, this would be reversed. Very interesting. Right, here we go. Right, so this is then where we get into the some more home sales stuff here. So this is just comparing UK housing starts with US new home sales. Right, what we've got here, this is US housing starts compared to the EU home ownership rate. And you see it went up in the 2000s and dropped right back and has been falling ever since. US housing starts don't seem to have a lot to do with that. But it shows what you can compare different things with different things and look for, for correlated trends and then think of reasons why that might be. So existing home sales month on month in the US. Wow, look at that. And then that's pretty steady. Home ownership rate in the United Kingdom. Okay. What I'm actually getting at or was looking for in there is that I feel that the UK housing market is very shallow. There are a very small number of transactions, pointing to a large overall average increase in prices. Whereas because there's not a lot of strength in the market, that can flip quite quickly. And the action, most of it is driven by remortgage lending and very safe bank lending, which is pumping up prices in the top end of the value range. I mean, it kind of drags up at the bottom end as well, but at the bottom end, there's just virtually no new supply coming in compared to previous levels of supply. And at this stage, it's a completely manipulated market with not a lot of depth in it, which makes it pretty shaky, in my opinion. And that applies to basically all of these different countries that we've been analysing stuff. So what I got here, home ownership rate in the UK and the US home ownership rate compared, and it's just very interesting. I mean, look at that. What else have we got? So, right, so here we have money supply stuff now. So this is US M2 money supply. So this is a narrow money measure, and the EU money supply M2. And you can see that, you know, we're more or less living in a centralized global economy, full stop already. So US bank balance sheets and UK bank balance sheets. I found this quite interesting because the experience of UK bank balance sheets have been rather less, or rather rockier than US bank balance sheets. And as arguably the US banks are the ones that screwed it up for everybody back here in 2008, it looks like the UK banks have taken a lot of the pain, and the US banks have obviously just sailed on quite merrily. So that's quite a shocking graph, that one. I should spend a bit more time looking at that. Then, so this is the US central bank balance sheet compared to the UK central bank balance sheet. So they're sort of generally going in the same direction, but it's kind of a little bit like a foot race with different people in the lead at different times. But what is significant here is that in the run-up to the financial crisis, we're here. So this is right. United States bank balance sheet is 8 billion, 8.75 trillion. That's US there. So these are the trillions on this side, and these are the pounds on this side. But so that's gone from about 1 trillion in 2008 to 8 trillion, or nearly 9 trillion in 2022. Right, that's the US central bank balance sheet, and the UK has gone from about, I think that's, is it 100 billion? Hold on, it is huge. Right, euro area. We'll get back to that one. I won't forget. Euro money M2 supply compared with Sweden M2 money supply. You can see there in concert. United Kingdom Central Bank and the ECB Central Bank again doing similar things, but the UK banks in 2008 again had a much rockier ride. Right, this is G20 central bank balance sheets. Let's just do the UK here. We'll just look at the UK on its own terms. Maximum. So 2008 is about 1 million. So is that? And then we've got in here we've got, blimey, there's a lot of noughts here. 200,000 up to 1 million. So, gee, mind-boggling. Right, let's just go here. Right, at the moment it's this. Copy. Small from alpha. Work it out for us. All these noughts. So, oh, Jesus. Right, let's just do this. So, right. Yeah, so we're at 1.119 trillion. Okay, let's just. Okay, which means that here it's about 100 billion. I mean, that's a tenfold increase in. That's staggering. It's a staggering increase in the central bank balance sheet. Quite remarkable. And then if we compare that with the commercial banks, right, United Kingdom, banks balance sheet. So right, there we go. They had a very rocky time after 2008. They bottomed out here in about 2016, which is the recession that no one talked about, and then they've been recovering since. Now, UK banks balance sheets. Let's have a look. 4.4 trillion. Yeah. So 4.4 trillion from 3.4 trillion. So it's gone up by 30%, whereas the bank balance, the central bank balance sheet, has gone up from 100 billion to 1.2 trillion. That is truly staggering. But it's the same in the States. And what that is basically, I think, pointing towards is the central banks effectively making the commercial banks redundant. It's massive centralization, and you see it particularly in Japan, Well, you only get numbers on this for the central bank in Japan. The commercial banks, they don't even do the numbers on here anymore. So why do we need this centralized control? What's it pointing towards? And if energy is so important to the economy, what sort of rations are they going to put us all on? What, i.e., how are they going to distribute the credit that's got this massive centralized control now? You know, what policies are they seeking to implement? And I think that the policies are being driven by energy. Obviously, the narrative is being driven by the CO2 hypothesis, the climate change hypothesis. But that hypothesis fits in reasonably well with the energy idea. The energy idea is definitely a real factor here, which not many people argue with that, apart from classical economists that completely ignore it. But don't forget, they ignore money in their models as well. So anyway, let's just click through some of the others. Germany, here you see M2 against the monetary policy is just so, it mirrors, the growth curves in the different sectors that are remarkably correlated. German banks' balance sheets, US banks' balance sheets. So the German banks, obviously, here we are, 2000. That's probably a Deutsche Bank event of some sort there. And then up to 2015, and then they had another whoopsie here. The US banks' balance sheet, they've just had a much smoother ride. What we got here? German central bank balance sheet against the EU central bank balance sheet. Well, no surprises there. Right, UK. What's this one? Right, UK M2 and then GDP at constant prices. So this is GDP at constant prices. Very interesting. Right. So this is United Kingdom banks balance sheets. So that's this curve here, and this is GDP per capita purchasing power parity. So you can see it was going up just gently, and it's just fallen away massively. So here we are, central bank balance sheet against UK bank balance sheets. So that's what we were just looking at here. That's 100 billion here, up to nearly 1.8 trillion here. And the UK bank balance sheets have gone up by $1 trillion. So it's central banks in the UK, the Central Bank of England is about 25% now of the commercial banks, but they've become incredibly, hugely more powerful, and it's a continuing trend. So there's something very, very odd going on between what central banks now see as their role and what the role of commercial banks are. And I think the commercial banking has got to do with the open banking initiatives, which no one really talks about much, but which they talk about challenger banks and challenger sort of financial services things. So effectively, it's almost like a liberalisation of commercial banking along the lines of liberalisation of energy markets, which again we're seeing have not worked out terribly well, in the same way that liberalisation of railway networks haven't turned out terribly well, or private finance initiatives, and what obviously that is in store for the British National Health System. You know, that there's a whole bunch of stuff which are ideological power policy goals, which have been proven not to work, which are still being pushed. And yeah, these are the sorts of curves that people ought to be looking at. What else have we got now? Let's just keep going anyway. Saudi Arabia banks' balance sheets. So the central bank. Yeah, the thing that struck me about this one is it's going in the opposite direction to everywhere else. So the Saudi central bank has become less influential as regards the Saudi Arabian banks, commercial banks. Now that's just interesting. I haven't figured out why I think that is, but it's bucking a trend that's going on everywhere else. Answers on a postcard. We've got here now France central bank balance sheet doing the same as Germany, so that's France and the ECB. France bank's balance sheet, France central bank balance sheet, so that's just the other way around. So anyway, all these ratios as between central bank balance sheets and commercial banks balance sheets, the trend has been universally, with the exception of Saudi Arabia. Maybe there are some others. I have to look at some of the other oil exporting countries. Norway would be an interesting one to look at. But the central banks in energy importing companies, let's put it that way, or the US, it's arguable whether that's a net importer at the moment or not. But the general trend is that central banks have become much more powerful, as expressed by their balance sheets. And what they're doing to their balance sheets tend to suggest that they're planning to take a more primary acting role in economies, which is consistent with the BlackRock Going Direct report. Again, that was produced in September 2019, and immediately, already by later in 2019, early 2020, BlackRock had started bailing out exchange-traded funds, which their partners, Vanguard Group, State Street Bank, and a lot of the very large monopoly commercial banks who actually own the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and who have a big say in the central bank of central banks, the Bank of International Settlements. Effectively, the COVID pandemic has masked or acted as a beard for a bailout of the banking system, and also a huge increase in the what looks like a permanent change in terms of the influence in going direct via the central banking system. And central bank digital currencies speak to going direct to the customer, and commercial banks and the idea of local commercial banks serving local markets, it's become a global version of the famous Halifax advert of the computer says no, and that's what all of these curves without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, point to as happening now in real time. This was interesting, actually. The Sweden's bank balance sheet. As I say, are we headed to a way of doing things in Sweden or a way of doing things in China? Both of which are not attractive to liberty-minded, common law-minded. I'm a Welshman, or basically a British patriot, as it were, even though I live in Sweden. But what this shows here, so the Sweden's bank's balance sheets, you see in 2008, they pumped up the balance sheets during the crisis. The central bank balance sheet there, and then pulled back off there again, but it has then had the same consistent growth ever since. And then so this is the Swedish financial crisis, where they had to bail out their banks, which is why in 2008 the action needed to be taken. Sweden didn't have nearly as much effect going forward as that, which then allowed, here we go, in 2016-17, this was the Swedish banking system's reaction to the fall off in world demand at that point. So it's interesting that the central bank worked in tandem with the Swedish banks to deal with that blip, yet the general trend is also that the balance sheet of the Swedish central bank has grown in relation to an importance in respect of the Swedish banking networks or commercial banks thing. But they seem to have their shit together, managing this stuff better than some of these other economies, and they're managing the same transitional ideas, if you like. And I tell you what I'm going to do now is I'm going to let's just have a look at Norway, because I haven't looked at Norway. Let's see if Norway's more like Saudi Arabia or more like Sweden. Europe, Norway, here we go. Norway, money. So let's have a look at M2. Central bank balance sheet. They haven't got the Norwegian banks in there. That is incredibly interesting. So that's more like Japan. Well, let's have a look anyway. So there you go, Max. Right, let's compare that to pick a country. Norway. Indicator. Actually, no, we don't. Let's compare it to the euro area. That's a good fit there. Right, central bank balance sheet maximum. Oof. Wow. And then let's just compare it to pick country. Right, well, I can't compare that to the Norway commercial banks, but you can see that the central bank balance sheet has increased massively since 2002. Look there, we've got 6 noughts there, so that's 2 trillion. This is Norwegian krone, 2 trillion, up to 14 trillion. That's 7 times. Wow. Okay, right. So you can't see if that's the same as Saudi in relation to the Saudi commercial banks because there aren't any. Well, none listed there anyway. We've done that one. What else have we got? Japan. Okay, so Japan. So Japanese home ownership went up to about 2004, dropped back, went up again to about 2014, and then dropped back. But it's been much more stable because that's ranged from 60% to 61%. So that's within the range. That's not such a dramatic effect. It's interesting. And this is Switzerland. So this is the Swiss central bank balance sheet compared to the Japanese. Now, let's just go here. Overlink. Let's have a look at Switzerland. Money. So, balance sheet. Okay. So, Swiss banks, the blue here, gone from 500, no, so it's 500 billion, is that right? Up to 2 trillion. And the same thing's happened with this. It's gone from 2 billion-ish to 10 billion-ish. Right, so again, the same thing there. The Swiss central bank has become much more punchy relative to its commercial banks. Again, so same thing there. Right, so where does that leave all of this then? So I made some notes before I looked at all those curves earlier, so I'm just going to sort of get some ideas down here. So the starting point is a definition of prosperity, and Tim Morgan gives his definition of prosperity. It's in those blogs that I referenced earlier. And I wanted to just flesh that out a bit more. And so I sort of said, well, right, obviously you've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some people think that you should measure the level of national happiness. And there is a level of income above which general well-being or levels of happiness don't exist. Now, I think that used to be about £60,000 a year about 20 years ago in the UK. What it is now, I really don't know. But effectively, the general level of income and disposable income that should be available, not to be worrying about the end of the month and living from hand to month. You know, like if you're needing to visit a food bank towards the end of a month, then that and maybe working a couple of jobs and still finding yourself in that position, that obviously isn't a high enough level of average income in the economy, and it means that actually incomes have gone up. So if someone's in that position, they are not living according to a level of prosperity which would be I would say it should be a human right. So to work out what that figure is an exercise, and a number of things to pay for that idea can be things to do with dealing with monopolies, the manipulated demand advertising. So this is persuasive advertising as opposed to informative advertising, all of those good old arguments. And the idea of most of the brands in most of the staples in most of the supermarkets are produced by a very small number of international conglomerates, and they are exploiting basically an oligopoly position, and so the level of profit which go to people exploiting that position is effectively stealing prosperity from a large group of people to provide excess monopolistic profits to another group of people. And that isn't capitalism, that's monopoly capitalism. And when it's enabled or absolutely asserted and encouraged by a state, that's state monopoly capitalism. And state monopoly capitalism was Roosevelt's definition of fascism. So other points of action and starting points are, one needs to do a stock take and then also look at supply chains of inputs into stocks of resources and energy, and then also the demand on the stock of energy or resources for meeting production needs over a defined economic period. So that might be, say, a seasonal period. So you have seasonal peaks, for instance, in terms of when you bring in a harvest of agricultural crops, you then have a stock until the next period. So although you've kind of got a reserves idea, it's a flow. And the same thing is true in energy production. Even though you can sort of say that, you know, if you say there's a finite amount of fossil fuels and discoveries are whatever they are, hydro is a flow that feeds into a pool along with those maybe finite reserves, maybe not. But it's a dynamic equation. It's not like you start off with 100 of them and then you end up with none of them. There are different rates of replenishment, even from other, say, renewable sources. And then how those are drawn down become a function of base power available on the electric grid and storage of energy. Now, storage of energy doesn't just have to be in terms of battery storage. There's such a thing as pump storage. There are different ways of dynamic storage. I'd call it Sisyphus storage, if you will. So when you've got more than you need from solar and wind, effectively that would push the rock uphill, becoming Sisyphus storage, and then the rock rolling back downhill would basically turn that energy for pushing the rock up into kinetic energy as it rolls back down. That's basically how pump storage works, but it's also how different sort of pulley-based storage you can have counterweights in coal shafts, for instance. So stock and flow analysis of inputs and outputs are key to understanding the whole of the dynamic equation as respects energy, but also as respects to resources that get converted into stuff. When you then start getting into recycling, and in the blog I did on the Paradigms Lost and Found, the Robert Ayres paper on how big a waste paper basket, which I look at in my arguments against Stephen Kurt's paper on population, his population doomster paper. So rates of production and the mix of that production and how it affects the seasonal stock, which through a cycle of seasons will give the amount of available energy, and the potential can be increased by such things as building nuclear power stations and thorium-based nuclear reactors that are a very, very promising field of solving really the large part of our energy requirements worldwide. So when it comes to other things like buildings or whatever, one looks at existing stocks, conversion of existing stocks, refurbishment of existing stocks, and recycling of existing stocks, materials into other stuff. So again, there are different degrees of adaptation, like in cars, for instance, hybrid cars, electric cars, or hydrogen fuel cell cars. What the other thing is you can actually have electric rail or induction rail type electric vehicle infrastructure. So there's a whole host of options to increase the inputs into a seasonal stock of energy, and the hard limit is in the the maximum amount available in a period of time. And over time, that can be increased. So these are problems that can be solved. And so then in terms of priorities and talking about hierarchy of needs or levels of happiness, or how we do the discussions we have with priorities, talk about shelter, provision of passive housing, obviously efficiency there, food, permaculture, yields, dealing with replacing petrochemical fertilizers with some other system of fertilizing crops, irrigation, water, that sort of thing. Leisure and culture, incredibly important to well-being and it's obvious through the response to COVID-19 that culture, leisure, the arts, all of those things are not at the forefront of the technocratic, algorithmic mindset. And that, in terms of general well-being and general health and the human condition, is a massive blind spot in the unbalanced structure of leaderships and personality types in decision making and executive decision making roles. The balance of viewpoints is completely skewed, and again, that's not to the general benefit of everybody, including the the algorithmic sort of technocratic mindset people. Education, health provision, transport, so they're the other things. So in terms of thinking about prosperity, priorities, and asking the right question, and the right question to be asked at the moment is, how do we continue to grow the pie and distribute the growth of the pie in a more rational, informed way, given that certainly since the financial crisis, since the beginning of the 2000s, all the indicators are that things are being done less well, even as the possibilities and potentials have never looked better. Effectively, what we've got is a bunch of monopolists stealing defeat from the jaws of victory. That I think I'll end on that note. Great, thank you.